Let's take a short break with a homegrown uplifting track. This is Be Who You Wanna Be from Newcastle band Never Say Never Music.
Be who you wanna be.
This is for the struggle. This is for the hustle.
Be who you wanna be.
This is for the struggle. Come on, use that muscle.
Check out Be Who You Wanna Be and more from Never Say Never Music on your favourite streaming platform or visit neversaynevermusic.com.
Bring it back.
You ever had those kids on a road trip asking you how long it's going to be, or they start a question and it's like, why? But why? But why? You know, there's times when you sort of put up with it for a little while, but eventually it's like, come on, just snap through. There's something in us that we want to know something more constantly, isn't there? And as much as we don't want to be as an annoying why, I think it's perfectly okay to question something as important as faith. Something like the Christian religion, which says this is the way, there is only one way to get into a relationship with God. I think that's worthwhile questioning. And my guest today is Rebecca McLaughlin. She's written the book Confronting Christianity, 12 Hard Questions for the World's Largest Religion. Looking forward to this conversation. Please do like, rate, review, share the podcast. It gets it out to more people. Let's have a chat with Rebecca. Rebecca, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Wonderful to have a chat about this book and specifically this idea of hard questions. Firstly, I should probably just set the scene a little bit. From your perspective, your faith perspective, I'm assuming you're following Jesus in a Christian relationship?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. The other thing we should sort of just set as we go, and something certainly I'm a big believer in, and I'm assuming because you have written this book as well, but let's just check, is that the idea of a faith that is true, that holds true, has to be able to be questioned. And I think over many different iterations at times, it seems like some parts of the world of the Church of Christianity saying, oh, you can't question this and you can't question that. My belief is very much you can question all of it because if it's true, it will stand up. Is that sort of your take and the reason you sort of wrote the book like this?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a concept of anti-fragility, which some sort of psychologists in the US are talking about in terms of raising children. So do we think about children being fundamentally kind of fragile, needing to be protected all the time? Or do we think about them as being anti-fragile, i.e. kind of needing a little bit of knocking about, not in a physical sense, but, a little bit of testing to grow their resilience? I would love for my children to have an anti-fragile faith, i.e. if they're going to be followers of Jesus, for it to be something that's really been tested in their lives and that they've been able to ask questions, they've been have questions asked to them by friends or teachers or whoever who are not followers of Jesus. I don't feel the need to kind of protect the message of Jesus as if it was something that might break in my hands, because I actually think he's the strongest and best hope that the world has to offer. So I'm not really kind of afraid of the faith in Jesus being kind of knocked around a bit.
Now, we're going to have a little bit of a deep dive into some of these questions today. We're obviously not going to be able to cover all of them or indeed all parts of it. That's why you've written the book in the first place. But before we sort of even get into talking about this one or that one as some of those 12 sort of confronting questions, just the decision of which ones to choose. As I go through those, I feel like some seem a bit sort of, well, we've got to say those ones. Something like, how could a loving God allow so much suffering? I think that's been a question that a lot of people have asked for a long time. How did you actually go about choosing which questions? Because I think some are a bit more obvious, like that one, and some are a bit more, I'm like, well, that's a great question to ask. I wouldn't have necessarily thought that's the top one, but I'm so glad you did.
Do you know, I literally just sat down and wrote a list of what kinds of questions my friends, I grew up in the UK in pretty secular environments where most of my friends, both in school and university, were not only not Christians, but actually would have really kind of good reasons for not even considering Christianity. And so I just literally sat down and wrote down the top 12 questions that I felt like I'd been asked over the years. And they just kind of came out. I'm actually curious which ones you think aren't obvious in that list.
Well, the couple that I had that I thought, well, I wonder, depending on which parts of the world perhaps you're in, was Doesn't Christianity crush diversity? I thought that was a really interestingly phrased one that was there. And around, doesn't religion hinder morality? Because I thought some people might think, well, actually, it sort of helps create a moral sort of understanding. I understand the flip of that as well. So they were the couple that for me jumped out. I thought, oh, they're really interestingly phrased that maybe I wouldn't have come straight away. So they were the two for me anyway.
Yeah, I think on the diversity one, I think a lot of people think that because the claims of Jesus are universal, like not just for one place or one culture or one time or one people, and not just the kind of thing that could be true for me but not for you, that somehow this therefore eliminates belief in diversity and caring about people from different kinds of backgrounds, when actually Christianity has been the greatest movement for diversity in all of history. You know, from the very beginning, Jesus was breaking through every racial and cultural barrier of his day. He then told his disciples to go and make disciples of all nations. And the church around the world today is all over the place. I mean, it's the only truly kind of global belief system, Christianity, with significant numbers of people who are followers of Jesus, not only in sort of Europe and North America, where I live, but also in Africa, in parts of Asia, kind of across the world. It's like genuinely an exceedingly diverse group of people when it comes to race, culture, language, etc. And that's very much a feature of Christianity, not a bug.
I remember there was a famous quote from Rick Warren that said, "Look, if you don't like diversity as a Christian, you're going to hate heaven because there's a whole lot of diversity going on in that regards." Could I just say, is there a question that of these 12 that sort of more often than not perhaps is the first question when someone asks you something like that, or they hear that you're writing something like that, they're like, oh, this is the question I want to ask? Or is it dependent on, where someone's been brought up, the culture they've been brought up in, the environment? How have you sort of taken those questions? Is there some that sort of rise to the top?
Yeah, I think so. I now live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the northeast of America, and there are a lot of people who live around me here who would consider themselves very sort of politically liberal in a number of ways, and would be skeptical of Christianity first and foremost, actually, because of the kinds of claims that Christians make about sex, essentially. And so one of the chapters is on, isn't Christianity homophobic? And I think that's probably one of the top questions, or one of the first questions that I get asked in one form or another when I'm talking with non-believers in my environment here.
And I think, you even reference in your book, hey, you might have flipped straight to this chapter, just letting you know. And I think that's probably the case, that often it does seem to be, especially in our culture and in our conversations in the Western parts of the world at the moment, that this is the topic that we're talking about the most. Maybe let's start there. From your perspective, how did you approach that question and what you wanted to share in this book?
Yeah, it's a question that I come to very much personally. It's as long as I can remember, as I mentioned, I've been a follower of Jesus, and ever since I sort of had romantic feelings, from my teenage years onwards, it was always directed toward other women or girls at the time. And so this is the questions that I've come to and had very much skin in the game, as the expression goes. And what I found as I've looked into what the Bible has to say about sex and about marriage is that it's all about a love story that's much bigger than we even realize. So I sometimes say to friends who have questions about that topic, Christianity is much weirder than you think when it comes to what Christians believe about sex, because it's not just that Christians believe, as the Bible teaches, that sex only belongs in marriage between one man and one woman, but that we believe this is all about a metaphor. It's actually meant to be a kind of fleshed out picture of Jesus's relationship with his people. And this is something you see sort of stories starting to be told at the very beginning of the Bible and right through to the end, the last book of the Bible, and the book of Revelation. And is especially kind of clarified in one of the Apostle Paul's letters to a bunch of Christians in the first century. And in this sort of picture, husbands and wives are meant to relate to one another like Jesus and his church, which is kind of a weird idea. But one of the things that it means is that sex and marriage and sort of romantic and sexual fulfillment from a Christian perspective it is meant to be at its best a tiny echo of Jesus' love for us. And so it's not meant to be the be-all, end-all. It's not meant to be the destination, as it were. It's meant to be a signpost of something so much greater than itself. And I think that's really important to understand when you're thinking about, what does the Bible say about sex and about marriage. And it's also really important to understand that in the New Testament, we see, this very specific vision for marriage as male-female, and that being the only right context for sex. We also see an insistent command that comes again and again and again in different forms for Christians to love one another, not in the sense of marriage and not even in sort of parenting sense, although those are both good and wonderful things, but actually loving one another as sort of brothers and as sisters. And so it's not that Christianity doesn't have a vision for love between believers of the same sex. It actually has a beautiful and glorious vision, but it's not the same vision as the one for marriage. And so I think as I respond to people's questions about sex and same-sex sexual relationships, one of the things I want people to see is actually, this is all about the gospel message of Jesus' love for his people. You've got to kind of get that central, or else nothing else makes sense. And that the kind of love that believers are called to with one another, it is really extraordinary. In fact, Jesus, on the night that he was betrayed to his death by one of his closest friends, he said to his disciples, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends." So the love that I can have with my female friends, sort of in particular, I think, brotherly love for male friends as well. But I do think there's something particular about love between believers of the same sex, is something that also reflects Jesus's love for us. But it's reflecting a different kind of element of it, a different aspect of it than marriage kind of love.
I'm wondering also, Rebecca, if we could sort of ask you, we as we mentioned at the start, we can't go through all 12 of these, but on our program here, we've discussed various aspects of some of these Christian questions in the past, and there's some that I don't think we've really touched off on in the last little while, the last few years at least. And I wonder if we could ask you about some of those. In chapter 5, you talk about, doesn't religion cause violence? And I think there's certainly been many aspects of the history of faith, the history of Christianity as well over the last 2,000 years, where it seems to have been the answer, well, yes, very clearly there's a certain way that people have looked at this where they would say, well, if it's the Crusades or whatever else it might be, there's a creation of violence. How did you approach that topic, and I suppose how does it speak to our world today?
Yeah, it's so interesting because people always mention the Crusades in this respect. And I actually spent a chunk of the book kind of looking at the Crusades because I think our perception of what happened at the Crusades is somewhat not representative of what in fact did happen. So it's often in the minds of Westerners today, it's often the kind of peaceful Muslims were out of nowhere kind of attacked by these Christian sort of crusaders coming from the West and seeking to eradicate them, as if this was a sort of way of spreading Christianity. In actual fact, the reason the Crusade started to happen was because Muslim armies sort of overwhelmed Eastern Christians and also sort of taken over Jerusalem, and Western Christians who'd been kind of called on for a very long time, for years and years, and hadn't kind of responded to their brothers and sisters in the East, sort of eventually came. Now, there were some horrific things done by the Crusaders, not only against Muslims, but actually also against Jews. And so much of what kind of happened there was horrifying and something that the Bible itself would diagnose as sinful. But it's interesting that our first thought when we're looking for an example of Christian violence is to go to something like that happened 1,000 years ago, which is not to say it's not important, but it's just sort of interesting that we've kind of got to dig a long way back for that. Now, of course, since then there have been multiple examples of supposedly Christian countries or people even fighting about questions of faith. So you see that at various points in European history. And so the question for us to ask is okay, we see violence, we see warfare basically throughout history all over the world, sort of one way or another. So it's not, and we've sort of seen examples of countries and situations that have tried to kind of take religion out of the equation. So, for example, communism is famously kind of atheistic, and actually the Nazism of Hitler's Germany, while it was kind of trying to grasp on to some of what the church was supposedly standing for in terms of propaganda, it was also sort of at heart exceedingly anti-Christian. Even in if you read the papers of those who were leading that movement. But let's look at communism. I mean, tragically, communism is responsible for even more deaths than the Nazis in sort of European history in the 20th century. So it's not obvious that kind of taking religion out of the equation necessarily helps. And then we need to look at, okay, what kinds of religious claims are we talking about? Because Christianity, and if you look at the teachings of Jesus, sort of really radically non-violent and very much against some of the instincts that we might have and that our kind of countries sort of historically have had in terms of a sort of orientation toward violence. Jesus would turn us in completely the opposite direction. And I think if we have a realistic kind of view of human nature, we'll recognize, what we have here is a human problem that different religions might sort of channel in different ways. And I would argue that Christianity is profoundly kind of against violence, except in the case of defending the vulnerable. I mean, that's kind of the best case you can make from a scriptural perspective for war, is that you're actually needing to kind of protect those who are vulnerable. But yeah, the idea that if we could only get rid of religion, we would also get rid of violence has been pretty obviously kind of disproved in the history of the 20th century.
My guest on Towards Understanding is Rebecca McLaughlin. She is the author of the book Confronting Christianity, 12 Hard Questions for the World's Largest Religion. We're going to be back with her in just a couple of minutes' time as we ask a few more of these questions, including how could a loving God send people to hell? That's on the way next here on Towards Understanding.
Share your brand, your event, your message across 90 Christian radio stations and major cities in Australia and New Zealand by sponsoring Towards Understanding, hosted by Clayton Bielen. More than 210,000 people tune into Towards Understanding each week, and with just one sponsorship, you'll reach this immense engaged audience. Find out more about this exciting and unique opportunity now on the sponsorship page at positivemedia.com.au.
Just before the break there, Rebecca, we were talking about this idea around doesn't religion cause violence? And certainly we talked about some of the historic examples and even some in this last 100 years or so. Just one further question on that before we start chatting about a couple of the others. We're often seeing in our sort of polarized society, especially the last 5 or 10 years, certainly you're living in America at the moment too, and we're seeing that the sort of religion and even Christian faith is getting caught up a lot with politics, and maybe it's not like full-on violence in the streets necessarily the whole time, but there's elements that it's kicking up a bit more and more. Do you feel like it's being used around the world at the moment in wrong ways like it has been in the past? It's just maybe shaping differently?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think it's really important for Christians like me to be cautious of and aware of the sort of dangers of is Christianity getting tethered to, for example, nationalism. And that's not the only direction that it can go, but it's often a direction that it goes, to where you can end up with things that sort of sound Christian adjacent, or a lot of talk of God, being tied into a sense of the rightness of your own country, and often tied into a desire to either to sort of conquer other countries, or at least to get rid of as many people who might have immigrated to your country as possible. There can be kind of edges to it like that, and it's actually really hard to make that case from a Christian perspective, because if we read through the Bible, we see, in the Old Testament, we see a deep concern of God for what sometimes in Bible translations called the sojourner, or the refugee, or the immigrant, could be other translations of that word, and a sense that God's people need to care for those who are looking for a place to live. So there's sort of an impetus toward care and away from a sort of rigid nationalism there. And then, as we were mentioning in the earlier segment, Christianity has, from the first, been a multicultural belief system. I mean, Jesus' claims are universal. He says at the end of Matthew's Gospel, one of the biographies of him that we read in the Bible, he says to his disciples, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations." And we see people from different nations coming to faith in Jesus from the very beginning. And we see it all around the world today, Christians in all sorts of different cultural and linguistic and ethnic contexts. And so that then makes it sort of hard to put your hand on your heart as a Christian and sort of have a nationalistic view. I mean, it's fine to be sort of patriotic, and I come from the UK, and we'll happily kind of raise a glass to whatever sports team my country is fielding. But at the end of the day, recognizing my connection with my fellowship with my sort of shared citizenship with Christians around the world in completely different cultural contexts runs much deeper actually than my sort of national identity. And I think that's one of the ways in which sometimes talk that sounds Christian but often ends up not being gets tethered to a sort of nationalistic identity.
One of the questions you had in there as well was, how could a loving God send people to hell? I think this is certainly one that as people ask a bit more questions around Christianity, it sort of leads down to, and I think is probably quite a common question to be asked as well. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I said in the book, I think it's the only truly hard question, because it's the one about the end of the story. I guess it's like it's the most painful thing that I believe as a Christian, actually, as a follower of Jesus, that those who haven't trusted in him are in fact facing God's judgment. And I think from a lot of people's perspective, it can seem like it's just really arbitrary. Why would randomly believing in this guy who died 2,000 years ago get you like a ticket to a place called heaven, and not believing in him get you a ticket to a bad place called hell? And I understand why people sort of have that impression. I think we Christians aren't always the best at explaining what the message of Christianity is. But it's interesting, if you look at the claims of Jesus, then you find that he's making claims which actually it makes real sense that if we accept him, we will get all that is good, and if we reject him, we'll get the opposite. Jesus, for example, says that he is the light of the world. Now, if that's true, then being without Jesus means being in complete darkness. Jesus says he is the way, the truth, and the life. If that's true, it means that being without Jesus means being completely lost and everlastingly dead. He says he's the bread of life. If that's true, then being without Jesus means being desperately hungry. And really, the central message of Christianity isn't trust in Jesus and you get to go to heaven. It's if you trust in Jesus, you will get to be with Jesus forever. And that is what heaven is. And heaven is actually a kind of shorthand for everlasting life with Jesus, who is the embodiment of the creator God who made you and made me. And so it's not arbitrary or disconnected, that if we trust in Jesus, we get to be with Jesus forever. And if we reject Jesus, we don't get to be with him forever. It's a bit like, I've been married for the last 17 years to my husband, Brian. And if when he asked me to marry him, if I had said no, then I shouldn't be surprised to not be living in the same house as him, not living in his house 17 years later. Yeah. I said yes, and so I live in his house, and we live together, and we sort of share our lives. And that's kind of like the central message of Christianity, is that if we accept Jesus' offer of everlasting life and love with him, then we will get everlasting life and love with him. If we reject it, then we won't get that, and instead we're continuing to kind of carry the weight of our sin, our rejection of God, and at the end of the day, we'll find that everything that we took for granted, the air that we breathe, the food that we eat, the light that we see, the love that we have, all of that actually is lost if we are apart from Jesus. And instead, I mean, the depiction of God's judgment is us being kind of cut off from all of those good things and facing instead the sort of terrible reality of being, facing God's righteous, rightful, just condemnation of our rebellion against him.
You sort of referenced it as you started answering that question there too, Rebecca, but I wanted to come around to this idea that, you've called the book 12 Hard Questions for the World's Largest Religion. And I was wondering if, even as you've described each of them, it feels like you may have been able to call it 12 misunderstood issues around the world's hardest religion, because it feels like that there's just been, for whatever reason, it's been time, it's been incidents, it's been things that they've turned into questions, but they're actually perhaps misunderstandings. My question to you is that a fair assessment, or am I perhaps making that a bit too simplistic?
Yeah, I think the way I put it is that each of these 12 questions are ones that people have good reasons for having those questions. And sometimes it's connected to the sort of history of sinful behavior of Christians. So I don't think it's a misunderstanding that is sort of wild and crazy and like, how could you possibly think that? But I think that with every one of these seeming roadblocks to faith in Jesus, when you look more closely, it actually becomes a signpost. So I think, for instance, when you start thinking, okay, I don't want to consider Christianity because of the history of violence, and then you think about, okay, where do my ideas about justice come from? Where do my ideas about the valuing of human life come from? Like even the valuing of the life of somebody from a country my country may be at war with. Where do we get this idea that we should care about the poor, or those who live in places sort of millions of miles away from us that we may never encounter and would only sort of in political terms be in a hostile relationship with? But actually all of that comes from the teachings of Jesus. And so often people are critiquing the history of the church on the basis of the teachings of Jesus. And that's actually a good thing to do. That's something that
Yes.
If you're not a Christian, you should be pointing out to your Christian friends the ways in which they or their church or the sort of history of their church isn't living up to Jesus' teaching. But if we take Jesus out of the equation, we're not left with this perfectly coherent secular understanding that gives us all those things of universal human rights and equality and care for the poor and equality of men and women and the value of human life, even among infants or the very old or the disabled. All of those things actually fall apart in our hands if we pull Jesus out, because we got those ideas from Christianity in the first place. And without Christianity, we don't have any really rational basis for holding on to those beliefs.
I think one of the other ones which you did touch on in the book as well is where it sort of gets turned on its head is that one that you put in chapter 8, doesn't Christianity denigrate women? And I think if we look at Jesus and we understand, especially as we understand a bit more of the culture of that day, like far from denigrating women, Jesus was doing the complete opposite and putting women at the absolute heart of the work that he was doing and the ministry that he was a part of, and cherished women in a remarkable way, and their input, their value, their understanding into all of society. And I think it is one of those ones that often gets turned on its head as we understand a bit more.
Yeah, and I think a really striking example of this as we look around Western culture today, and Australia is very much included in this. The rise in consensual sexual violence that we've seen in the last few years that has led to women being treated in truly horrifying ways, and our culture saying, oh, this is great, like this is fine, this is all good. It is one example among many of the fact that actually when we take Christianity out of the system, we don't end up with women being more respected and better loved and valued. We actually often end up with quite the reverse. And I think, one of the counterintuitive truths of Christian sexual ethics is that actually it turns out to work out especially well for women. I mean, it works out best for men as well, but truly the kind of sexual culture that we've created in the 21st century West is measurably bad for women. And I don't just say that. I would say that even if I were not a Christian, because I've looked at the data and it's just true.
Rebecca, as you sort of have written this book, and I'm so glad that you did, and we're willing to say, look, here's these 12 questions that are often asked. Let's not avoid them. Let's get into this conversation. Where do you think the next step is? If somebody perhaps is thinking, well, all right, I want to ask these hard questions about Christianity. Maybe I'm just starting on my faith journey. Maybe I'm not there yet. I want to ask around it. What is the best thing? Obviously, they read this book. They have that. What's the next sort of step? Is it to make sure they go to someone they trust to chat? Is it to read something further than that, to deep dive on one topic? What's your best encouragement for them?
Do you know, one of the absolute best things that you could do is actually to show up at your local church. Why do I say that? I say that in part because there you will hopefully hear more of the Bible explained. And if the church isn't explaining the Bible, then you need to find another one. I say that also, I've got a book just coming out later this month called How Church Could Literally Save Your Life, which is looking at the mental and physical health benefits of going to church every week that have been documented by none other than the Harvard School of Public Health. So even if you're not convinced by Christianity yet, going to church, if you have kids, taking your kids to church, like it's actually measurably good for your mental and physical health. So that would be a great place to start in exploring the claims of Jesus. And Christianity is meant to be an understanding of the world where faith in Jesus is closely tied up with love among God's people. So that would be a great place to start exploring, not only sort of individually and reading the text about Jesus. Is a wonderful thing to do as well, to read through the gospel accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the New Testament, which is sort of short biographies of Jesus that we find there, and seeing, what you make of him. But also to do that in community with other people who are showing up on a Sunday at your local church, and you might get to talk to them about Jesus as well.
Oh, that's exciting stuff. I love that there's some research to back that up too. What a great encouragement. Rebecca, thank you so much for taking the time today, for writing these various books as well, and for giving such great thought and depth to it. We've so appreciated it. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Rebecca McLaughlin is my guest. She is the author of the book Confronting Christianity, 12 Hard Questions for the World's Largest Religion, here on Towards Understanding.
Let's take a short break with a homegrown uplifting track. This is Be Who You Wanna Be from Newcastle band Never Say Never Music.
Be who you wanna be.
This is for the struggle. This is for the hustle.
Be who you wanna be.
This is for the struggle. Come on, use that muscle.
Check out Be Who You Wanna Be and more from Never Say Never Music on your favourite streaming platform, or visit neversaynevermusic.com.
Bring it back.